Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Stephen Phelan. Welcome to my video. This is an exclusive video that I've created for the dentists that have joined our mailing list at phelandentalseminars.com, our email list. And the video is called How to Create a Custom Implant Transfer for Aesthetic Implant Cases. And basically the whole point of this video is to achieve an excellent gingival outline form and gingival architecture around your implant cases. And this is a case that I treated about 5 years ago that I'm going to use to illustrate the techniques that I'm going to talk about in this video. And basically this is a case with two central incisor jacket crowns and two lateral incisor veneers. And the case has a pretty good gingival outline form. It's kind of what we're shooting for with decent papilla heights and papilla volume and tissue levels. And if you look at the case, if you look deeper at the case, it's basically two central incisor implants with zirconia abutments. And what I'm going to show you today will help you understand how to achieve a good tissue result when you're placing a single tooth implant in the aesthetic zone or two implants next to one another in the aesthetic zone. So here's the case when we started. Basically the patient had a hockey accident and took a hockey stick to the face and fractured his two central incisors to the point that they could not be restored again. And if you look here, basically the treatment options, all the treatment options involve taking these remaining teeth out, the two central incisors, removing them, but the options after that are we could do a partial denture, we could do a fixed bridge, or we could do two central incisor implants. And I went over all the options with the patient and he decided he wanted two central incisor implants. And the main concern when we're doing two implants next to one another in the aesthetic zone is the tissue between the two implants. It's very hard to get a papilla or achieve a final papilla around a case like that. So I explained this to the patient. I told him we do everything we can to achieve a good result, but you know, it's a difficult case to get a good result. So he understood that the expectations needed to be lowered a little bit, but we would do everything we can to make this work. So if you look here, I actually had the surgical treatment completed by a periodontist colleague of mine, Dr. Jim Janikowski. And Jim basically was removing the teeth for us, and he removed all the little bits and pieces that were fractured, and then he essentially drilled out the roots because we wanted to remove the roots as atraumatically as possible. So he drilled a big kind of central post space in the roots and then imploded the little pieces inward so that we wouldn't damage the soft tissue and the bony architecture. Basically we wanted to keep the buccal plate of bone intact and the interdental peak of bone intact as much as possible. And at that point the teeth were removed, the bone looked really good, and if you have a case like this, the next step is placing immediate implants. And if you can place immediate implants and get good primary stability, that will generally preserve the bone and the soft tissue architecture the best. And Jim basically placed the implants with a flapless technique into the sockets, but more palatally positioned into the sockets. So you engaged the palatal bone and left the buccal plate of bone intact as much as possible and grafted around the space between the buccal of the implants and the buccal plate of bone. Now this case was done 4.5 years ago. So basically we used Straumann TE level implants. We didn't use the bone level implants because they were not available at the time. If I was doing the case today, we would use the bone level implants because they're even better for a case such as this. And so here are the implants in place. And a couple of things that Jim did to create an opportunity to maintain the papilla. He's placed the implants, as we said, slightly palatal so that we've maintained the buccal plate of bone. And we've also placed the implants at the correct depth so that they're at a correct depth relative to where the CEJ will be, or the gingival margin will be, basically. And then the other thing that he did was he created enough space, or placed the implants with enough space between the platforms. And the papers that you would read about this technique would tell you that you need a minimum of 3 millimeters between each implant platform to preserve the inter-implant peak of bone as much as possible. And this case was done with 3.5 millimeters between the two implants. So that's one of the primary things that you have to look at when you're doing a case like this is, do you have enough space to place the implants and have enough space between the implants so that you don't encroach upon the inter-implant peak of bone. And so at this point, he had good primary stability of the implants, and we thought to further preserve the soft tissue outline form and not have it collapse, we would support it with immediate provisionals. And the patient had essentially almost an anterior open bite, so we felt that we could do this without putting a lot of function or pressure on the provisionals. So basically we decided to make some immediate provisionals. I'm going to take some Straumann posts. These are provisional posts, and I opaqued them. Today they have the meso abutment, which is tooth colored, but back 4 years ago they had these posts, and basically I opaqued them with the Creative Color opaquer, and then we took some extra long screws, and the screws basically come out the end of the posts long enough that I can then use a shell that represents the tooth form that we want to achieve with the provisionals and have holes in the shell, and then I can basically unscrew the provisional complex. So basically we have this shell that we made from a model that we happen to have, fortunately, before the accident for this patient. And then the holes are in the palatal so that I can seat the shell over top of the implant abutments and then get at these screws and unscrew the implant abutments. And then when we put the final provisionals in, we basically use shorter screws at that point, obviously, so the screws aren't sticking out that far. So basically we used ProTemp. We picked up the abutments with the ProTemp. I tried not to inject the ProTemp subgingivally. I didn't want to get it down around the implant platform and around the implant itself, because that would potentially lead to peri-implantitis. So we basically picked up the abutments and then filled in all the spaces subgingivally with flowable composite. And then we contoured this to have a fairly flat emergence profile. I wanted to support the tissue without putting a lot of pressure on it initially. We can always put pressure on it later when the whole thing is osseointegrated. So here it is immediately post-surgery. And here we are basically 5 days post-surgery, and everything looks amazing, but you have to keep in mind that you'll have some bone remodeling and tissue shrinkage and remodeling as the case heals. So here we are at 6 weeks, and it looks quite a bit, it still looks quite good. We've had a little shrinkage and a little bone remodeling, but overall it looks quite good. And here we are at 14 weeks post-surgery. The implants are osseointegrated, we feel, at this point, but the tissue is a little blunted looking, so I now want to change the provisional contours to change the tissue contours. So if you look here, the patient had less than ideal oral hygiene. We did tell him to be really careful with this, but his oral hygiene wasn't quite as good as we would like, so we want to clean all this up. I'm going to take the implant provisionals, which were splinted together, and cut them into two so that he could floss between the two implant crowns, between the central incisors, and we can push on the tissue a little bit, because right now the tissue has kind of a blunted appearance, and I want it to have more of a triangular peaked appearance. So what we'll do is we'll basically change the contours of the provisional crowns to push on this tissue subgingivally to change the shape. So if we push on it subgingivally and leave a little space for a peak of tissue, the tissue should reconform to that shape that we're asking it to follow. So here I'm just adding flowable composite subgingivally, and then we place these provisional crowns. They're not splinted anymore. The patient can floss and have better oral hygiene, and I've left a little bit of space so that we can have a better peak of tissue created. And if you look here, once we've kind of finished the contouring, the tissue looks much better, and it has a more triangular appearance. It looks more like what I want the final restorations to look like. Here it is here about a month after doing this. I've probed around it to see how the tissue is. There's just a little peak of bleeding there, but for the most part it's nice and healthy and pretty firm looking. So what I want now is I'd like my final impression to represent this really closely. And you know, if you take these provisional crowns off, basically this tissue will collapse a little bit because it's not being supported anymore. So what I would like is I'd like to take my transfer, my implant impression transfer, and have it support the tissue the same way that these provisional crowns support the tissue. So I'll show you the technique for that. Basically, we take the provisional crown, we screw it onto an implant analog. So here I am screwing it onto the analog. I then coat the gingival third of this crown and the analog with a product called Mach 2 disilicone. And what that does is it takes an impression of the gingival third of the provisional crown. You can use a heavy body impression material for this as well. I wouldn't use extra light, it would run all over the place. But the disilicone's been designed for this kind of work, so I like to use that. So now we unscrew the provisional crown and we have an impression of the provisional crown's contours attached to the analog. We can then screw a transfer onto this. So I'm going to do a open tray impression technique. And we fill the space. The space represents the contour of the provisional crown. We fill that space with flowable composite attached to the analog. And now the analog, or the transfer, attached to the transfer has the same contours as our provisional crown. So when we place this in the mouth, it supports the tissue the same as the provisional crown. So our impression will have the same tissue represented in it that we have in the mouth. And that's basically the whole point of this. You know, in the posterior part of the mouth, you don't need this as critically, but in the anterior portion of the mouth, in the aesthetic zone, this is an important step to creating a good aesthetic result with implants. So here's our transfer. It's basically shaped like the provisional crown now. And we can take this and screw it onto the implant. We take two of them, and we basically are supporting the tissue. So here are the two provisional crowns. Here we've coated them with Mach 2 disilicone. And now here's the space that represents the shape and the contour of the provisional crown. We put flowable composite resin into this space and attach it to the implant transfer. And now we have a transfer that's customized to represent the aesthetic outline form of the provisional. So it's a pretty simple technique, but it adds to the aesthetic outcome of your case. You can see how nicely the tissue's being supported by this transfer. Very similar to the way it's supported by the provisional crowns. Here's another view. You can see the tissue between the two transfers is peaked, has a little peak between it like a papilla, like it is with the provisional crowns. So then we send this to the ceramist and he builds the case, and he uses a little tissue mold which represents the tissue from the patient's mouth, which he uses our impression to make. So this is very accurate at this point. And this case is done with zirconia abutments and lava crowns and porcelain veneers, layered porcelain veneers on the lateral incisor. So you can see all the layering that goes into the case. The case was completed prosthetically by Harold Heindel, who's a master dental ceramist in Seattle, Washington. And here are the abutments and the crowns and the veneers in place. And just another view of the abutments. And an overall view of the case. So it's beautiful ceramic work. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to work with Harold on quite a few cases. And so the patient comes back and he's ready to have the case inserted. And you can see he's neglected to floss a little bit between the two central incisor implants, and I have a little more blunting of the papilla again. So there's a slight blunting. It looks like the tissue is relatively healthy, but I believe that we'll have to take a look at how the contours look relative to the final restorations. And if we have blunting there, And when I put in the final crowns, there was a little blunting of the papilla, but I thought it was so small that it would fill in and the tissue would recontour and fill that space in. So we just said we'd leave it for a week or two. Patient came back a week later and the tissue has filled this space in. So it looks good. Now if it didn't fill it in, I could send the crowns back and have them the contact point extended and the space closed, but I ideally didn't want to do that. I wanted to give the tissue a chance to fill in around that space. So here we are before and after, and I think it's a pretty reasonable result for this patient, and part of it is good implant positioning, part of it is the ability to put the provisional crowns on right away and support that excess tissue that he had, and part of the result is because we were able to take an excellent impression that represented what we achieved with the provisional restorations. And here's the patient. You can see he has a high enough lip line that he shows most of the outline form of his gingiva around these implant crowns. So if I didn't go through all these steps to preserve the tissue and then mold the tissue and then capture the tissue in the final impression, I don't think we could have achieved a result like this. And with this high lip line, I don't think he would have been very happy. So I'm glad we were able to achieve this result for this patient, and I hope showing you this little video will help you with some of the cases that you have coming up in your own office. So thank you for joining us on this video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave a comment on our blog page or send me an email. I'm happy to receive questions, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll hopefully see you at one of our future seminars. Thank you.